What would you do if your own father traded your freedom for a horse? At just 19, Astrid is handed over as a virgin to a powerful Viking warrior she's never met, forced to abandon everything she's ever known. But what awaits her beyond the pine forests is not just a man, but a life she never asked for. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story, and where you're watching from, and why you're following this. The cold wind swept across the fjord with a ferocity that seemed to cut through flesh and bone, carrying with it the scent of salt and pine from the distant forests that blanketed the Norwegian highlands. It was the year 897, and the village of Ravnsfjord stood as a collection of timber longhouses huddled together against the harsh northern climate, their turf roofs weighted down with stones to prevent the relentless gales from tearing them away. Smoke rose from the central hearths of each dwelling, creating ghostly columns that twisted and dispersed into the overcast sky above. In one of the smaller longhouses at the edge of the settlement, a young woman named Astrid sat by the flickering light of the hearth fire, her fingers working mechanically at the wool she was spinning. Her beauty was undeniable even in the dim light, with golden hair that fell in thick waves past her shoulders, skin as pale and smooth as fresh cream, and eyes the color of summer sky that seemed to hold depths of emotion far beyond her 19 years. Her features were delicate yet strong, with high cheekbones and full lips that rarely smiled these days. She wore a simple woolen dress dyed a deep blue, fastened at the shoulders with bronze brooches that had belonged to her mother, and a linen apron tied at her waist. The door burst open with a crash that made Astrid flinch, and her father, Bjorn, stumbled inside. He was a man who had once stood tall and proud, a respected farmer in the village, but years of poor harvests and the death of his wife 3 winters past had broken something fundamental within him. His clothes were stained with mud and ale, his graying beard unkempt, and the smell of fermented honey mead clung to him like a second skin. His face was weathered and lined, but it was his eyes that told the true story of his decline. They were bloodshot and vacant, holding neither warmth nor recognition when they fell upon his daughter. "Father," Astrid said softly, setting down her spindle and rising to her feet. "You should rest. You've been drinking again." Bjorn waved a dismissive hand in her direction, nearly losing his balance as he did so. He caught himself against the timber wall, leaving a grimy handprint on the wood that Astrid had scrubbed clean just that morning. "Don't tell me what I should do, girl," he slurred, his words thick and clumsy. "You know nothing of a man's burdens." Astrid felt her heart sink deeper into her chest, a familiar weight of dread settling over her like a heavy cloak. This was not the father she remembered from her childhood, the man who had taught her to identify the calls of different birds, who had carved her wooden toys with patient hands, who had lifted her onto his shoulders so she could see over the crowd at the summer festivals. That man had died along with her mother, leaving behind this hollow shell that sought solace in drink and gambled away what little they had left. "We have no food for tomorrow," Astrid ventured carefully, her voice measured and calm despite the anxiety that churned in her stomach. "The grain stores are nearly empty, and winter approaches. Perhaps if you spoke with Jarl Eriksson, he might allow you to work in the—" "The Jarl!" Bjorn spat the title as if it were poison. "That pompous fool has no use for me. None of them do. They look at me and see weakness, failure. But I've found a solution, Astrid. A way to restore our fortunes. To gain what we need to survive the winter." Something in his tone made Astrid's blood run cold. She had heard that particular quality in his voice before, usually when he had made some foolish wager or drunken promise that would cost them dearly. "What have you done, father?" she asked, though part of her did not want to know the answer. Bjorn straightened himself as much as his inebriated state would allow, and something like pride flickered across his features. "I've made a trade," he announced. "A most advantageous trade. There's a Viking warrior, lives alone in the northern reaches beyond the pine forest. Name's Ragnar Ironside. He came to the village today seeking companionship, a wife. He offered a magnificent horse, one of the finest I've ever seen, strong enough to pull a plow through the rockiest field, valuable enough to trade for grain and livestock that would see us through 3 winters. The implications of his words crashed over Astrid like a wave of ice water. Her hands went numb, and the blood drained from her face. "No," she whispered, shaking her head slowly. "Father, no. You couldn't have. You wouldn't." "I've given my word," Bjorn said, and there was a finality in his statement that left no room for argument. The deal is struck. In 3 days' time, you will go to Ragnar Ironside as his wife. You should be grateful, girl. You're 19 years old, well past the age when most women are wed. This is your purpose, your duty to your family. Astrid felt the walls of the longhouse closing in around her, the smoke from the hearth suddenly suffocating. Her entire life reduced to a transaction for a horse. Her father had bartered her away like a sack of grain or a sheep, and he stood before her now expecting gratitude. Anger surged through her veins, hot and fierce, but beneath it lay a deeper current of profound betrayal and helplessness. "You sold me," she said, her voice trembling despite her efforts to control it. "You sold your own daughter to a stranger for an animal. Mother would be." "Your mother is dead," Bjorn roared, and the sudden violence in his voice made Astrid take an involuntary step backward. "Dead and gone, and I am left to do what I must to survive. You think I wanted this? You think I haven't tried every other way? The traders won't extend me credit. The Jarl has turned his back on our family. And you sit here spinning wool, as if that will fill our bellies when the snow comes." Tears burned in Astrid's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her break, not when he had just shattered what remained of her world. "What do you know of this man?" she demanded. "This Ragnar Ironside? Is he old, cruel? Why does he live alone if he is such a great warrior?" Bjorn shrugged, already losing interest in the conversation now that he had delivered his pronouncement. He shuffled toward his sleeping bench, dropping heavily onto the furs that covered it. "I know he's wealthy enough to own a horse worth more than our entire farm. I know he's strong enough that no man in the village would dare challenge him. That's all you need to know. In 3 days, you'll go to him. Until then, prepare yourself. Gather what belongings you wish to take." He rolled onto his side, dismissing her entirely, and within moments his snores filled the small space. Astrid stood frozen, staring at the man who had given her life, who had once been her protector and provider, and felt nothing but a vast emptiness, where her love for him had once resided. How had it come to this? How had they fallen so far? She thought of her mother, Sigrid, a woman of quiet strength and gentle wisdom who had taught Astrid everything she knew about keeping a household, about healing herbs and star navigation, about finding beauty in the harsh world they inhabited. Sigrid had died bringing Astrid's younger brother into the world, and the baby had followed his mother into death before his first sunrise. The double loss had been too much for Bjorn to bear, and he had sought escape in ale and mead, in dice games and foolish risks, until there was nothing left of the man he had been. Astrid moved mechanically through the longhouse, banking the fire for the night, ensuring her father wouldn't freeze in his drunken stupor despite her anger. She climbed into her own sleeping alcove, pulling the fur blanket up to her chin, and stared into the darkness above her. Sleep would not come easily tonight, she knew. Her mind raced with questions and fears about the future that awaited her. Who was Ragnar Ironside? The name suggested he was a warrior of some renown, the epithet Ironside typically earned through great feats in battle or exceptional resilience. If he was wealthy enough to trade a valuable horse for a wife, why had he not simply chosen one of the many eligible women in the village through normal courtship? Why seek out her father specifically, a man known for his weakness and desperation? The questions circled in her mind like carrion birds, offering no answers, only more anxiety. Astrid pulled the blanket tighter around herself, seeking comfort in its warmth even as her thoughts grew colder and more fearful. In 3 days, her life as she knew it would end. She would leave this longhouse, this village, everything familiar, and go to a stranger who had purchased her like property. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters and finding every gap in the timber walls. It seemed to Astrid like the voice of fate itself, crying out in warning, or perhaps in mourning for the girl who would cease to exist in 3 days' time. She closed her eyes and thought of her mother, imagining Sigrid's gentle hands stroking her hair, her soft voice singing the old songs that spoke of brave shield maidens and wise women who shaped the destinies of great men. "Give me strength, mother," Astrid whispered into the darkness. "Help me face whatever comes with courage, even if I cannot face it with hope." The night stretched on, each hour marked by the slow dying of the fire and the ceaseless moaning of the wind. Tomorrow would come, as it always did, and with it one day less before her world changed forever. Astrid lay awake listening to her father's snores and the creaking of the longhouse, and tried to prepare herself for a future she had never imagined and did not want. But what choice did she have? In this world, in this time, a daughter's duty was obedience, even when obedience meant surrendering everything she held dear. The morning light filtered through the smoke hole in the roof, pale and cold, offering little warmth to chase away the chill that had settled deep in Astrid's bones. She had slept poorly, her dreams filled with shadowy figures and endless journeys through dark forests. Now, as consciousness returned fully, so did the crushing weight of reality. In 2 days, she would become the property of a man she had never met, traded for a horse like a piece of livestock. Astrid rose from her sleeping bench and dressed quickly in the frigid air, her breath forming small clouds that dissipated as quickly as they appeared. She wrapped a woolen shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside, needing to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the longhouse and her father's presence, even if he still slept off his drunken stupor. The village was already stirring to life despite the early hour. Fishermen prepared their boats at the shore, checking nets and oars with the practiced efficiency of men who had performed these tasks countless times. Women emerged from their homes carrying wooden buckets, heading toward the central well or down to the stream that ran along the eastern edge of the settlement. Children darted between the buildings, their laughter and shouts a sharp contrast to the heaviness in Astrid's heart. She walked toward the well, her own bucket in hand, needing the routine task to ground herself in something familiar. As she approached, she saw several women already gathered there, their voices carrying on the morning air. Astrid recognized them immediately. Helga, the blacksmith's wife, a robust woman with strong opinions and a sharp tongue. Ingrid, who was married to one of the Jarl's warriors. And Thera, a young widow who lived with her brother's family. The conversation died abruptly when they noticed Astrid's approach. The women exchanged glances laden with meaning, and Astrid's stomach tightened. News traveled quickly in a village this size, and she had no doubt that her father's transaction had become common knowledge by now. "Astrid," Helga said, her voice carrying a mixture of pity and curiosity that made Astrid's skin prickle with discomfort. "We heard about your arrangement with the northern warrior." Astrid lowered her bucket into the well, focusing on the simple mechanics of the task rather than meeting the women's eyes. "Word travels swiftly," she said, her voice carefully neutral. Ingrid stepped closer, her face showing genuine concern beneath her curiosity. She was a kind woman, known for her gentle nature, and Astrid had always liked her. "Is it true, then? Your father has promised you to Ragnar Ironside?" The name hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Astrid pulled the bucket up, the rope rough against her palms, and finally met Ingrid's gaze. "It's true," she confirmed. "In 2 days' time, I am to go to him." Thyra gasped, pressing a hand to her chest in a gesture of dramatic sympathy. "But Astrid, you know nothing of this man. They say he lives like a hermit in the wilderness, that he has scars covering his body from countless battles. Some claim he's half-giant, fierce and terrible to behold." "Thyra, don't fill the girl's head with nonsense," Helga chided, though her own expression suggested she found the rumors intriguing. She turned to Astrid, her weathered face serious. "I won't lie to you, child. Ragnar Ironside is known to our people, though he rarely comes to the village. He is indeed a formidable warrior, one who fought in the great raids across the sea years ago. They say he was wounded in battle, grievously so, and chose to withdraw from that life. He built his homestead in the north, beyond the pine forest, and has lived there alone for, it must be 5 years now." Astrid absorbed this information, trying to build a picture of the man who would become her husband. A wounded warrior seeking solitude, wealthy enough to own fine horses, strong enough to survive alone in the harsh northern wilderness. It told her much and yet nothing at all about what kind of man he truly was, about whether he would be cruel or kind, harsh or gentle. "Why does he want a wife now?" Astrid asked, voicing the question that had haunted her through the sleepless night. "If he has lived alone for so long, why seek companionship at this moment?" The women exchanged glances again, and it was Ingrid who finally spoke, her voice soft and hesitant. "My husband heard from the trader who passes through the northern territories that Ragnar's homestead has grown prosperous. He has fields that need tending, livestock that require care, a household that needs a woman's hand. Perhaps he has simply decided that solitude, while peaceful, is not sustainable for a man who plans to remain in these lands. Or perhaps, Thyra added with a knowing look, he has finally healed enough from whatever wounds drove him to isolation, and seeks what all men eventually seek, sons to carry on his name and legacy. The words struck Astrid like a physical blow. Sons. Of course, that was what this was truly about. Not companionship, not partnership, but the production of heirs. She would be expected to share his bed, to bear his children, to spend her body and her life creating the next generation for a man she had never seen. The thought made her feel simultaneously cold and flushed, her stomach churning with a mixture of fear and something she couldn't quite name. "Have any of you seen him?" Astrid asked, hating the tremor in her voice that betrayed her anxiety. "Can you tell me what he looks like?" Helga tilted her head, considering. "I saw him once, perhaps 2 years ago, when he came to trade furs at the market. He is tall, taller than most men, with broad shoulders and a warrior's build. His hair was dark, like oak bark, worn long in the old style. He had a beard, well kept despite his isolated life. His face—" She paused, searching for words. His face was hard to read, stern perhaps, but not cruel. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who has seen battle and survived, who fears little in this world. "And the scars?" Astrid pressed, remembering Thyra's earlier comment. "I couldn't say," Helga admitted. "He was fully clothed, as men are in the marketplace, but the way he moved suggested old injuries, a slight favor to his left side as if compensating for pain or stiffness. Whatever wounds he suffered in his warrior days, they did not break him entirely." Astrid filled her bucket, the weight of the water matching the weight on her soul. She thanked the women for their information, ignoring their pitying looks and Thyra's dramatic sighs, and made her way back to her father's longhouse. The village seemed different now, each familiar building and face a reminder of what she would soon lose. This had been her entire world for 19 years, and in 2 days she would leave it behind, forever. When she entered the longhouse, she found her father awake, hunched over a piece of stale bread and looking even worse than he had the night before. His hands shook slightly as he raised a cup of water to his lips, and the morning light was merciless in revealing every line and shadow on his face. "Father," Astrid said, setting the water bucket down with more force than necessary, "I spoke with the women at the well. They tell me Ragnar Ironside is a warrior who lives in isolation, a man none of them truly know. You have promised me to a stranger based on nothing more than his offer of a horse." Bjorn looked up at her, his eyes bloodshot and weary. For a moment, something that might have been shame flickered across his features, but it was quickly replaced by defensive anger. "What would you have me do, Astrid? Let us starve? Watch you waste away when winter comes and we have nothing to eat? At least this way, you will have a roof over your head and a strong man to provide for you. A strong man who might beat me, or work me to death, or treat me with less kindness than he shows his livestock." Astrid shot back, surprised by her own boldness. "You know nothing of his character, of whether he is good or evil, gentle or cruel. You saw only a horse and thought of your own survival, not of my safety or happiness." "Happiness?" Bjorn laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and broken. "You speak of happiness as if it is something we can afford. This is survival, girl. This is what the world demands of us. Do you think I am happy? Do you think I wanted to lose your mother, to watch everything I built crumble around me? We do what we must, not what we want." Astrid felt tears threatening again, but she forced them back. "Mother would never have allowed this," she said quietly. "She would have found another way." "Your mother is dead," Bjorn repeated, and this time the words carried less anger and more simple, terrible truth. "And I am doing the best I can with what remains. In 2 days you will go to Ragnar Ironside. You will be his wife, and you will make the best of it, as women have done since the beginning of time. That is the end of this discussion." He turned away from her, effectively dismissing her once more, and Astrid felt the last threads of hope snap inside her chest. There would be no reprieve, no miraculous salvation. Her fate was sealed, and all that remained was to prepare herself for it as best she could. The rest of that day and the next passed in a blur of preparation and painful goodbyes. Astrid gathered her few possessions, her mother's bronze brooches, some simple clothing, a small knife for everyday tasks, and a wooden comb that had been a gift from her mother. She visited the places in the village that held meaning for her, committing them to memory. The large oak tree where she had played as a child, its trunk scarred with the initials she had carved there, the rocky outcrop overlooking the fjord where she had sat for hours watching the ships come and go, dreaming of distant lands she would never see, the small shrine to the gods where her mother was memorialized, a simple stone with Sigrid's name carved into its surface. At the shrine, Astrid knelt and placed her hand on the cold stone, feeling the rough texture of the carved letters beneath her fingers. "I'm afraid, Mother," she whispered. "I don't know how to be brave when everything I know is being taken from me. If you can hear me wherever you are, please watch over me. Help me find strength I don't know I possess." The wind whispered through the pines that surrounded the shrine, and for a moment, Astrid could almost imagine it was her mother's voice, offering comfort across the vast divide between life and death. But the moment passed, and she was alone again with her fear and uncertainty. On the morning of the third day, Astrid woke before dawn, her body instinctively knowing that this was the day that would change everything. She dressed carefully in her best dress, a deep green wool that her mother had woven and dyed with her own hands. She braided her golden hair in the traditional style of unmarried women one last time, securing it with a ribbon that had belonged to Sigrid. She fastened her mother's brooches at her shoulders and looked at herself in the polished bronze mirror that hung on the wall, one of the few valuable possessions her father had not yet traded away. The face that looked back at her was pale but composed, beautiful despite the dark circles under her eyes from too many sleepless nights. She barely recognized herself, this woman on the brink of an unknown future. Where had the carefree girl gone? The one who had laughed and dreamed and believed the world held infinite possibilities. She had been replaced by this solemn stranger, and Astrid mourned the loss even as she accepted its necessity. Her father was already awake, attempting to make himself presentable for the transaction that would save his worthless life. He had trimmed his beard and wore his least stained tunic, though nothing could hide the tremor in his hands or the broken quality that seemed to emanate from his very core. "Are you ready?" he asked, not quite meeting her eyes. "No," Astrid answered honestly. "But that doesn't matter, does it?" Bjorn flinched as if she had struck him, but he said nothing. What could he say? They both knew the truth of their situation, the desperate measures that had brought them to this moment. Together they walked through the village toward the northern edge where Ragnar Ironside waited. The sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, a beautiful morning that seemed to mock the darkness of Astrid's situation. The path leading to the northern edge of the village wound between long houses and storage sheds, each step carrying Astrid closer to the moment that would define the rest of her life. Villagers paused in their morning routines to watch her pass, some with sympathy in their eyes, others with curiosity or judgment. Astrid kept her gaze fixed straight ahead, refusing to acknowledge their stares, her spine straight and her chin held high despite the trembling in her legs that threatened to betray her fear. As they rounded the final bend, Astrid saw him for the first time. Ragnar Ironside stood beside a magnificent chestnut stallion, his hand resting casually on the animal's neck. And even from a distance, Astrid could see that the rumors had not exaggerated his physical presence. He was indeed tall, standing well over 6 feet, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway. His body was powerfully built, the kind of physique that came from years of wielding weapons and engaging in brutal combat. He wore simple clothing, a dark brown tunic and trousers made of quality wool, and a thick leather belt from which hung a sayax, the single-edged knife that all free men carried. His hair was dark, somewhere between brown and black, worn long to his shoulders in the traditional Viking style, partially held back from his face by small braids at his temples. His beard was full and well-maintained, framing a face that was indeed stern, as Helga had described, with strong features that spoke of Nordic heritage, a straight nose, prominent cheekbones, and a square jaw that suggested both strength and stubbornness. But it was his eyes that captured Astrid's attention even from this distance. They were pale, possibly blue or gray, she couldn't tell yet, and they watched her approach with an intensity that made her feel exposed, as if he could see directly into her soul and measure her worth with a single glance. As they drew closer, Astrid noticed the details that the women at the well had mentioned. There was indeed something in the way Ragnar held himself that suggested old injuries, a subtle asymmetry in his stance that spoke of pain long endured and adapted to. A scar ran from his left eyebrow up into his hairline, pale against his tanned skin, evidence of a wound that should have killed him but hadn't. His hands, she noticed as they approached, were large and calloused, the hands of a man accustomed to hard work and violence in equal measure. The horse beside him was truly magnificent, its coat gleaming like polished wood in the morning sun, its muscles rippling beneath the skin with each small movement. The animal stood at least 16 hands high, with intelligent dark eyes and a bearing that suggested both strength and spirit. Astrid understood immediately why her father had been tempted by such an offer. This was not merely a horse but a treasure, an animal worth its weight in silver, capable of transforming the fortunes of a struggling farmer. "Bjorn," Ragnar said as they came to a stop before him, his voice deep and resonant, carrying the authority of a man accustomed to command. His accent marked him as local to these regions, though there was a quality to his speech that suggested education beyond what most farmers possessed. "You bring your daughter as agreed." "I do," Bjorn confirmed, his voice shakier than Astrid had ever heard it. In the presence of this warrior, her father seemed to shrink, to become even smaller and more pathetic than he already was. "This is Astrid. She is 19 years old, healthy and strong, a virgin as promised. She knows how to keep a household, to weave and cook and tend livestock. She has been raised properly, taught by her mother before her death." Astrid felt her face flush with humiliation at being described like livestock being sold at market, her attributes and qualifications listed as if she were a mare being offered for breeding. She forced herself to remain still, to not show the anger and shame that burned in her chest like hot coals. Ragnar's pale eyes, she could see now they were indeed blue, a striking shade like ice reflecting sky, moved from Bjorn to Astrid, and she felt the weight of his assessment as he took in her appearance. His expression remained neutral, revealing nothing of his thoughts, but something flickered in those cold eyes, some emotion too quick to identify before it was gone again. "Come here, girl," Ragnar commanded, his tone not harsh but brooking no argument. Astrid's feet moved before her mind could protest, carrying her the few steps that separated them. Up close, Ragnar was even more imposing, his height forcing her to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. She was not a small woman, standing taller than most females in the village, but he still towered over her by more than a head. The scent of pine and leather and something uniquely masculine surrounded him, and Astrid found herself holding her breath, waiting for whatever examination he intended to perform. Ragnar reached out, and Astrid flinched involuntarily before forcing herself to remain still. His large hand, surprisingly gentle despite its obvious strength and the scars that crossed the knuckles, tilted her chin up, turning her face from side to side as he studied her features. His thumb brushed across her cheek, testing the smoothness of her skin, and Astrid felt heat rising in her face at the intimate contact from this stranger who now owned her. "She is beautiful," Ragnar observed, speaking to Bjorn as if Astrid were not present, as if she could not hear him discussing her like property. "Her mother's blood runs strong in her features, I think. Sigrid was known for her beauty before her death." The casual mention of her mother from this man's lips startled Astrid. "You knew my mother?" she asked, her voice emerging stronger than she had expected despite her nervousness. Ragnar's eyes shifted back to her, and for the first time something that might have been approval crossed his face at her boldness in speaking without permission. "I knew of her," he corrected. "Before I withdrew to the northern lands, I spent time in this village. Your mother was spoken of with great respect, known for her wisdom and gentle nature. It is said you resemble her greatly, not just in appearance, but in temperament." "You know nothing of my temperament," Astrid said, the words escaping before she could stop them. Fear and anger and the overwhelming unfairness of her situation made her reckless. "You know only what my father has told you, and he would say anything to secure his horse." Bjorn made a strangled sound of protest or warning, but Ragnar held up his free hand, silencing him without even looking in his direction. The warrior's eyes remained fixed on Astrid, and now there was definite interest there, a spark of something that might have been amusement or respect. "You have spirit," Ragnar said, his deep voice carrying a note of satisfaction. "Good. I have no use for a woman who cannot speak her mind or who cowers at every shadow. The northern lands are harsh, and life there demands strength of both body and will." He released her chin but did not step back, maintaining the close proximity that made Astrid's heart race in her chest. "Tell me, Astrid, daughter of Sigrid and Bjorn, Can you read the runes? The question surprised her. Literacy was not common among Viking women, though it was not unheard of, particularly in families of some standing. I can, Astrid confirmed. My mother taught me. She believed knowledge was a form of wealth that could never be stolen or lost to misfortune. Wise woman, Ragnar murmured, and there was genuine warmth in his voice when he spoke of Sigrid. Can you calculate numbers, keep records of livestock and harvest yields? Yes, Astrid answered, confused by this line of questioning. My mother taught me that as well. She managed our household accounts before her death, and I continued the practice until my father. She trailed off, not wanting to speak of her father's decline directly in his presence, despite her anger at him. Until your father's grief consumed him and he let everything fall to ruin, Ragnar finished bluntly, showing no concern for Bjorn's feelings on the matter. I am aware of your family's circumstances, girl. I am aware of how you came to be offered to me. Do you think I would enter into such an arrangement blindly? The implication of his words struck Astrid like a blow. He had known. He had known her father was desperate, that she was being traded out of need rather than any normal courtship or arrangement between families. He had known and had still pursued the transaction, which spoke to either his own desperation for a wife or his willingness to take advantage of another's misfortune. If you knew, Astrid said, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion, then you knew I had no choice in this matter, that I am here not by my will but by necessity. Does that not trouble you, to take a wife who comes to you unwillingly? Every marriage is a transaction of some kind, Ragnar replied, his voice matter-of-fact rather than defensive. Whether arranged by families for political advantage, agreed upon for economic benefit, or entered into for personal desire, there is always an exchange of some sort. At least in our case, the terms are clear and honest. You come to me in exchange for resources your father needs to survive. I gain a wife with intelligence and capability, a woman who can manage a household and bear children. There is no deception here, no false promises of love or pretense of romance. His brutal honesty was somehow worse than if he had offered her empty platitudes or false reassurances. He was making it clear that he expected nothing from her but dutiful service, that whatever life awaited her in his northern homestead would be one of practical arrangement rather than affection or partnership. And if I refuse? Astrid asked, though she already knew the answer. If I say I will not go with you, that I would rather take my chances with starvation than submit to this? Ragnar's expression did not change, but his eyes hardened slightly. Then your father keeps nothing, receives no compensation for the time wasted, and you return to a life of slow death by deprivation. Additionally, you shame both yourself and your family by breaking an agreement already made and witnessed. Your reputation would be destroyed, and no man in this village or any other would take you as a wife, knowing you to be unreliable and disobedient. Is that truly what you wish? The cage of her circumstances closed even tighter around Astrid. He was right, of course. She had no real choice, no actual power in this situation. To refuse now would be to condemn both herself and her father to certain death, and while part of her felt he deserved such a fate for his weakness and betrayal, she could not bring herself to be the instrument of it. I see I have no choice but to accept, Astrid said, the words bitter on her tongue. But do not mistake my compliance for contentment, or my duty for devotion. You may own my body and my service, but my heart and my will remain my own. Something flickered across Ragnar's face at her declaration, some emotion she could not read. He nodded slowly as if confirming something to himself. Fair enough, he said. I ask only that you perform your duties with competence and accept your role in my household with grace. What you feel in your heart is your own concern, as long as it does not interfere with your responsibilities. He turned to Bjorn, effectively ending the conversation with Astrid as if her agreement or lack thereof was now irrelevant. The horse is yours, Ragnar said, handing the lead rope to Bjorn with the casual ease of a man parting with something of no particular importance. As agreed, he is strong and well-trained, capable of pulling a plow or carrying a rider with equal skill. Treat him well, and he will serve you faithfully. Bjorn took the rope with trembling hands, his eyes filling with tears that might have been gratitude or shame or some mixture of both. Thank you, he whispered, his voice breaking. Thank you, Ragnar Ironside. You have saved my life. I have traded for something I need, Ragnar corrected coldly. There is no altruism here, only exchange. He looked at Astrid, his pale eyes assessing. Gather your belongings. We leave within the hour. The journey to my homestead will take most of the day, and I wish to arrive before nightfall." Astrid nodded, not trusting her voice, and turned to walk back to her father's longhouse for the last time. The walk back to the longhouse felt surreal, as if Astrid were moving through a dream or watching herself from a great distance. Her father shuffled behind her, leading the magnificent horse that had cost him his daughter, and the sound of the animal's hooves on the packed earth seemed to echo the finality of what had just transpired. Villagers who had gathered to witness the exchange dispersed quietly, some shaking their heads in pity, others simply grateful that such misfortune had not befallen their own families. Inside the longhouse, Astrid moved mechanically, gathering the small bundle of possessions she had prepared over the past 3 days. Her hands trembled only slightly as she wrapped her few belongings in a square of wool cloth, tying the corners together to form a crude pack. Her mother's brooches were already fastened to her dress, cold metal against her skin that seemed to carry Sigrid's presence with them. She added the wooden comb, the small knife, 2 additional dresses, a warm cloak for the coming winter, and a small pouch containing dried herbs her mother had taught her to use for healing minor ailments. As she worked, her father stood in the doorway, blocking the morning light, the horse's lead still clutched in his hand. He seemed unable to speak, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly as he watched his daughter prepare to leave forever. Finally, when Astrid had secured her bundle and wrapped her cloak around her shoulders, Bjorn found his voice. "Astrid," he said hoarsely, and there was something raw in his tone that made her pause despite her anger. "I know you cannot forgive me. I know what I have done is unforgivable. But I need you to understand that I had no choice. We would have starved, both of us, and I could not bear to watch you waste away as your mother did, to see you suffer when I had the power to prevent it." Astrid turned to face him fully, and the words that had been building inside her for 3 days finally broke free. "You did have a choice, Father," she said, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened to spill from her eyes. "You could have worked harder, drunk less, maintained the dignity and connections that might have given us other options. You could have asked for help from the Jarl or the village council before things became so desperate. You could have done 100 different things, but instead you chose the easiest path, the one that required the least from you and the most from me." Bjorn flinched as if she had struck him, his weathered face crumpling with pain and shame. "You are right," he whispered. "You are right about all of it. I am weak, and I have failed you as I failed your mother. But please, Astrid, please know that I do love you, that everything I have done, however poorly, was done because I could not bear to lose you too. And yet you have lost me anyway," Astrid replied, the simple truth of it settling between them like a stone dropped into still water. "The moment you agreed to trade me for that horse, you lost any right to call yourself my father. From this day forward, I am Ragnar Ironside's wife, and whatever connection existed between us is severed." She picked up her bundle and moved toward the door, intending to walk past him and out of this life forever, but Bjorn reached out and caught her arm. His grip was gentle, pleading rather than restraining, and when she looked at him, she saw tears streaming down his face into his unkempt beard. "At least let me give you my blessing," he said brokenly. "Let me wish you well, even if you cannot forgive me. You are all I have left of Sigrid, and I cannot let you go into your new life carrying only bitterness and anger." Astrid stood frozen, torn between the desire to reject even this final gesture and the part of her that remembered the father he had once been, the man who had lifted her onto his shoulders and taught her to fish in the streams, and told her stories of the old gods under the stars. That man was gone, consumed by grief and weakness, but the memory of him remained, and it was that memory that made her pause. "Very well," she said quietly. "Give me your blessing, if it will bring you peace, but know that it changes nothing between us." Bjorn placed both hands on her shoulders, the traditional gesture of a father blessing his child, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of genuine emotion and regret. "May the gods watch over you, Astrid, daughter of Sigrid. May you find strength in times of trial, wisdom in times of confusion, and happiness in places you do not expect it. May your new life bring you blessings I could never provide, and may you know joy even if I am not there to witness it. You carry your mother's spirit within you, and it will guide you when all else fails." Despite her anger and hurt, Astrid felt something inside her soften slightly at these words. They were perhaps the most genuine thing her father had said to her in years, spoken with a clarity that the ale and mead usually stole from him. She nodded once, accepting the blessing without offering forgiveness, and then pulled away from his grasp. "Goodbye, Father," she said, and walked out of the longhouse into the morning light. Ragnar was waiting where she had left him, standing with the same patient stillness that suggested a man accustomed to waiting, to enduring discomfort without complaint. He had been joined by a sturdy cart hitched to a dappled gray horse, the cart bed containing what appeared to be supplies and equipment. When he saw Astrid approaching, he moved to meet her, taking her bundle without asking permission and securing it in the cart with practiced efficiency. "We travel by cart rather than horseback," Ragnar explained, his deep voice neutral and matter-of-fact. "The journey is long, and I thought you might prefer to ride rather than walk. Also, I have brought supplies from the village that need transport back to the homestead." It was a practical consideration rather than a gesture of kindness, but Astrid found herself grateful nonetheless. Her legs still trembled with the emotional weight of the morning, and the thought of walking for hours through unfamiliar territory was daunting. She nodded her acceptance and allowed Ragnar to help her up onto the cart's seat, his large hands steadying her with surprising gentleness as she settled onto the wooden bench. Ragnar climbed up beside her, taking the reins in his scarred hands, and with a subtle signal to the horse, they began to move. The cartwheels creaked as they rolled forward, carrying Astrid away from everything she had ever known. She did not look back at the village or at her father's longhouse. To look back would be to invite tears or regret, and she was determined to face her future with whatever dignity she could maintain. They traveled in silence through the outskirts of Ravensfjord, passing the last familiar landmarks before the path led them into territory Astrid had never explored. The land here was rugged and beautiful, covered in dense pine forests that climbed the hillsides, their dark green branches heavy with needles that whispered secrets to the wind. Rocky outcrops broke through the earth at irregular intervals, gray stone weathered by countless seasons of rain and snow. Small streams crossed their path periodically, their water clear and cold, flowing down from the mountains that loomed in the distance like ancient guardians watching over the land. As they traveled deeper into the wilderness, Astrid became acutely aware of the man sitting beside her. Ragnar held the reins with easy confidence, his body swaying slightly with the motion of the cart, apparently unbothered by the silence that stretched between them. His profile was strong and serious, his jaw set in what seemed to be its natural expression of stern determination. The scar on his forehead was more visible in the shifting light that filtered through the trees, a pale line that spoke of violence survived and pain endured. After perhaps an hour of travel, Astrid's curiosity finally overcame her resolve to maintain dignified silence. "How did you get that scar?" she asked, gesturing toward his forehead. "The one above your eye." Ragnar glanced at her, seeming surprised that she had spoken, but not displeased. "A Saxon blade," he answered simply. "During a raid across the Western Sea many years ago, we had landed on the coast of what they call Northumbria, seeking to trade and perhaps to settle. The local lord did not welcome our presence and sent soldiers to drive us away. In the battle that followed, one of their warriors caught me with his sword. I was fortunate. The blow glanced off bone rather than splitting my skull entirely. I still carry a dent in my skull where the metal struck, though the bone healed well enough." The casual way he spoke of such violence, of nearly having his head split open, was jarring to Astrid. She had heard tales of Viking raids, of course, of the warriors who sailed across the seas seeking glory and wealth, but she had never spoken directly with someone who had lived that life. "Is that where you received the injuries that caused you to withdraw from raiding?" she asked, genuinely curious now, despite her circumstances. "No," Ragnar said, his voice taking on a slightly harder edge. "That came later, during what was supposed to be my final campaign. We had joined a larger force, multiple jarls and their warriors united under a common purpose, seeking to establish a permanent settlement in the lands across the sea. The battle was fierce, lasting from dawn until long past sunset. I took multiple wounds, but the worst was a spear thrust to my left side that pierced between my ribs and damaged the muscles beneath." His free hand moved unconsciously to his left side, as if remembering the pain of that ancient wound. "The injury would not heal properly," he continued. "It festered despite the best efforts of our healers, and for many weeks I lay in fever, hovering between life and death. When I finally recovered enough to stand, I found that my left side remained weak, the muscles damaged beyond complete repair. I could still fight, still defend myself adequately, but I would never again have the strength and speed that had made me a feared warrior in my youth. "So you came home," Astrid said softly, beginning to understand the man beside her a little better. "You withdrew to the northern lands to build a life that did not depend on your ability to wield a weapon." "Yes," Ragnar confirmed. "I used the wealth I had accumulated from my years of raiding to purchase land and livestock, to build a homestead where I could live with dignity, even if I could no longer claim glory in battle. For 5 years I have worked that land, built that home with my own hands, and lived in solitude. It has been peaceful, in its way, but ultimately unsustainable. A man alone cannot manage all that needs doing, and a homestead without children has no future." The blunt reminder of why he had purchased her services brought Astrid back to her own reality. She was not here as a companion or partner, but as a solution to practical problems, the management of his household and the production of heirs to inherit what he had built. The romantic fantasies she had sometimes entertained as a girl, dreams of love and mutual devotion, had no place in this arrangement. They continued in silence for a while longer, the only sounds the creaking of the cart, the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves, and the whisper of wind through the pines. The sun climbed higher in the sky, warming the air slightly, though the shade of the forest kept them cool. Astrid found herself studying the landscape with growing interest, noting the abundance of game sign, the health of the trees, the clear streams that suggested good water sources. Whatever else might be said about Ragnar's choice of homestead location, he had selected land that could support life well. "Tell me about your homestead," Astrid said eventually, deciding that knowledge of her destination might help her prepare mentally for what awaited. "What should I expect when we arrive?" Ragnar seemed pleased by her question, his stern expression softening slightly. "The main hall is built in the traditional style," he began, though smaller than the great longhouses in the village, as it was designed for a single family rather than an entire clan. It is well constructed with thick timber walls and a solid turf roof that keeps out the rain and snow. There is a central hearth for cooking and warmth, sleeping alcoves along the walls, and storage for food and supplies. Behind the main hall, I have built a separate structure for livestock, housing my goats, sheep, and chickens through the winter months." He paused, guiding the horse around a fallen log that partially blocked their path before continuing. "The land itself consists of approximately 20 acres, much of it cleared for cultivation and pasture. I grow barley and oats, maintain a vegetable garden, and have planted several fruit trees that are beginning to mature. There is a good stream running through the property that provides water year-round and supports fish in season. The forest beyond my cleared land offers hunting, timber, and foraging opportunities." It sounded prosperous, far more so than Astrid had expected. Whatever Ragnar's physical limitations from his old wounds, he had clearly been industrious and capable in building his new life. "Do you have neighbors?" she asked. "Or do you truly live in complete isolation?" "The nearest homestead is about half a day's walk to the west," Ragnar answered. "A family named Thorson. Good people, though I see them rarely, perhaps 3 or 4 times each year when we trade goods or assist each other with major tasks. Otherwise, yes, I live alone, or have until now. It is one of the reasons I chose this location. The solitude allowed me to heal both body and spirit without the scrutiny or pity of others." The journey continued through the afternoon, the landscape gradually changing as they climbed higher into the northern territories. The dense pine forests gave way occasionally to open meadows filled with late-season wildflowers, their colors muted by the approaching autumn, but still beautiful in the slanting afternoon light. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks already touched with the first snows of the season, a reminder that winter approached with inevitable certainty. Astrid found herself relaxing slightly as the miles passed, the rhythmic motion of the cart and the peaceful beauty of the wilderness having a calming effect on her frayed nerves. Ragnar proved to be a surprisingly considerate traveling companion, stopping periodically to allow her to stretch her legs and attend to personal needs with privacy, offering her water from a leather flask and dried meat and bread from his supplies without her needing to ask. His manner remained formal and somewhat distant, but there was a basic courtesy in his actions that suggested he was not cruel, merely practical and unaccustomed to companionship. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, They crested a final hill, and Astrid caught her first glimpse of what would be her new home. The homestead sat in a natural clearing, surrounded on three sides by dense forest, with the fourth side opening onto cultivated fields and pasture. The main hall was indeed built in the traditional style, a long rectangular structure with timber walls that had weathered to a silvery gray and a turf roof from which grass and small flowers grew, making it seem almost like a natural part of the landscape. Smoke rose from the central hearth, suggesting that Ragnar had banked the fire before leaving that morning, and the dying light caught on the carved wooden posts that flanked the main door, their surfaces decorated with intricate patterns of vines and animals in the old style. Behind the hall, Astrid could see the livestock shelter Ragnar had mentioned, and beyond that, neat rows of what appeared to be vegetable gardens, their plants still heavy with the final harvest of the season. The entire homestead spoke of care and competence, of a man who took pride in his work and maintained his property with diligence. It was far superior to the deteriorating shambles her father's farm had become, and despite her circumstances, Astrid felt a small flutter of something that might have been hope. Perhaps life here would not be entirely unbearable. Perhaps there was something to be salvaged from this situation after all. "Welcome to your new home," Ragnar said, his deep voice carrying a note of what might have been pride or perhaps simply satisfaction at having completed the journey safely. He guided the cart up to the main hall and brought it to a stop, setting the brake and climbing down with the easy grace of a man whose body remembered how to move, despite old injuries. He came around to Astrid's side and offered his hand to help her down, and she took it, appreciating the steadiness of his grip as her stiff legs adjusted to standing after hours of sitting. The air here was noticeably cooler and cleaner than in the village, carrying the scent of pine and earth and the subtle sweetness of the late-blooming flowers in the nearby meadow. Astrid took a deep breath, filling her lungs with it, and felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. There was a peace here, a quietness that was different from the constant activity and noise of village life. "Come," Ragnar said, retrieving her bundle from the cart. "I will show you inside, and then I must tend to the horse and secure the cart for the night. You can familiarize yourself with the hall while I work." He led her to the main door, which was carved from thick oak planks and hung on iron hinges that showed expert craftsmanship. The door swung open smoothly, well-maintained and balanced, revealing the interior of the hall. Astrid stepped inside and paused, taking in her new domain with careful attention to detail. The interior was larger than it had appeared from outside, the single large room divided into functional areas by clever arrangement rather than walls. The central hearth dominated the space, a circular pit lined with stones where a fire still smoldered, sending lazy spirals of smoke up toward the hole in the roof. On either side of the hearth were the sleeping alcoves Ragnar had mentioned, each one framed with carved wooden posts and curtained with heavy wool fabric for privacy and warmth. At the far end of the hall was the high seat, a large carved chair that marked the place of honor where the master of the household would sit during meals or when receiving guests. The walls were hung with various tools and weapons, everything from farming implements to fishing nets to a magnificent sword and shield that must have been Ragnar's from his raiding days. Storage chests lined the walls between the sleeping alcoves, their surfaces carved with protective symbols and decorative patterns. The floor was packed earth, swept clean and covered in places with woven rush mats. Overhead, the timber beams that supported the roof showed the same careful craftsmanship as everything else, their surfaces smooth and fitted together with precision. What struck Astrid most, however, was how clean and well-ordered everything was. For a man living alone, Ragnar maintained his home with a level of care that suggested discipline and pride. There was no clutter, no accumulation of dirt or disorder. Everything had its place, and that place was clearly defined and maintained. It was the home of a warrior who had brought military precision to domestic life, and while it lacked the warmth and personal touches a woman might add, it was far from the crude bachelor dwelling she had half expected. "The alcove on the right will be yours," Ragnar said from behind her, and Astrid turned to find him watching her reaction with those pale, assessing eyes. "I have been using the one on the left. You are free to arrange your space as you wish, and tomorrow I will show you where supplies are stored so you can add whatever touches you feel the hall needs. For tonight, there is stew in the pot over the fire, bread in the storage chest near the hearth, and ale in the barrel by the door. Help yourself to whatever you need." With that, He set her bundle down near the right-hand alcove and turned to leave, pausing only at the doorway to add, "I will be occupied with the evening chores for perhaps an hour. Make yourself comfortable." Then he was gone, closing the door behind him and leaving Astrid alone in her new home. She stood in the center of the hall for a long moment, feeling oddly displaced despite the physical surroundings. This was her home now, the place where she would spend the rest of her days, and yet it felt utterly foreign, as if she had stepped into someone else's life rather than beginning her own. Slowly she moved to the alcove Ragnar had designated as hers and pulled back the wool curtain. The space was small but adequate, containing a sleeping bench piled with furs and wool blankets, a small chest for personal belongings, and a wooden peg on the wall for hanging clothes. A single oil lamp hung from a hook overhead, ready to be lit when darkness fell. It was sparse but functional, and Astrid could already envision the small changes she might make to personalize the space, to make it feel more like her own. She unpacked her meager belongings, placing her extra dresses in the chest, arranging her mother's comb and the small pouch of herbs on top of the chest where she could see them, hanging her cloak on the peg. The familiar items looked small and lost in this new context, reminders of a life that already seemed distant, despite having left it only hours ago. With her belongings settled, Astrid ventured to explore the rest of the hall more thoroughly. The storage chests contained an impressive array of supplies: grain in sealed containers to keep out moisture and pests, dried fish and meat hanging from hooks in the rafters, wheels of cheese wrapped in cloth, clay pots filled with preserved vegetables and berries, sacks of root vegetables that would last through the winter. Ragnar had clearly prepared well for the cold months ahead, his stores sufficient to feed 2 people through even a harsh season. The pot hanging over the fire contained, as promised, a thick stew that smelled of mutton, root vegetables, and herbs. Astrid's stomach reminded her that she had eaten little that day, too nervous to take more than a few bites of bread before leaving the village. She found wooden bowls stacked neatly near the hearth and ladled herself a generous portion, then retrieved a chunk of bread from the storage chest. The bread was dense and dark, made from rye and barley, still relatively fresh despite being a day or 2 old. She carried her meal to one of the benches near the hearth and sat down to eat, the warmth of the fire pleasant against her skin after the cool evening air outside. The stew was good, well-seasoned and hearty, exactly what was needed after a long day of travel. Ragnar might live alone, but he clearly knew how to cook adequately. Another surprise in a day full of unexpected revelations about the man who was now her husband. Husband. The word felt strange even in her thoughts. They were married in the eyes of law and custom, the agreement witnessed and the exchange made, yet they remained strangers to each other. Tonight would be their first night under the same roof, and Astrid felt her stomach tighten with anxiety at what that might mean. Would Ragnar expect to consummate their marriage immediately? Would he demand his rights as a husband, despite the lack of any actual ceremony or blessing from the gods? The questions circled in her mind like wolves, creating a growing sense of dread that made the food in her stomach sit heavy and uncomfortable. She was still a virgin, as her father had advertised, with no knowledge of what passed between a man and woman beyond the vague and often contradictory information she had gleaned from other women's whispered conversations. The thought of sharing Ragnar's bed, of allowing this large, scarred stranger to touch her in the ways a husband touched a wife, filled her with a mixture of fear and something else she could not quite name. The door opened, and Ragnar entered, bringing with him the scent of animals and fresh air. He had removed his outer tunic and wore only a simple undershirt that revealed the powerful muscles of his arms and shoulders, the fabric clinging to his frame in ways that made Astrid very aware of his physical presence. He moved to the water barrel near the door and washed his hands and face with the efficiency of established routine, then poured himself a bowl of stew and joined Astrid by the hearth. They ate in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the quiet scrape of spoons against wooden bowls. Astrid found herself hyper-aware of every movement Ragnar made, the way his jaw worked as he chewed, the slight wince when he shifted his weight in a way that pulled at his old injury, the size of his hands wrapped around the bowl that looked small in his grip. "You must be tired from the journey," Ragnar said eventually, setting his empty bowl aside. "The sleeping furs in your alcove are clean and should be warm enough, though if you find you need more, there are additional blankets in the chest at the foot of the bed. Tomorrow I will show you the full extent of the homestead and explain what your responsibilities will be. But for tonight, you should rest." Astrid set down her own bowl, her heart beginning to race as she tried to interpret his words and intentions. "And what of tonight?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are your expectations of me as your wife?" Ragnar's pale eyes met hers across the fire, and she saw understanding there, perhaps even a hint of sympathy for her obvious anxiety. "I expect nothing from you tonight except that you sleep and recover from the upheaval of your life," he said firmly. "You are exhausted, emotionally and physically. You have been traded like property and transported to a strange place to live with a man you do not know. Whatever obligations exist between us can wait until you have had time to adjust to your new circumstances." The relief that flooded through Astrid was so intense it made her lightheaded. She had been bracing herself for demands, for the assertion of rights that law and custom gave him over her body, and instead, he offered her time and space to breathe. "Thank you," she said, and meant it genuinely. "I appreciate your consideration." "Do not misunderstand," Ragnar added, his tone matter-of-fact rather than harsh. "I do expect this marriage to be real in all respects, including the physical. I need children, heirs to inherit what I have built, and you were brought here to provide them. But I am not such a brute that I would force myself on a frightened girl on her first night in a strange place. When we come together as husband and wife, I want you calm and willing, or at least accepting, rather than terrified and resistant." The honesty in Ragnar's words was almost startling in its directness, but Astrid found she appreciated it far more than false promises or empty platitudes would have been. At least she knew where she stood, what was expected of her, and that she had been given a reprieve, however temporary, to gather her courage and accept her fate. She nodded her understanding, not trusting her voice to remain steady if she spoke. "Good," Ragnar said, rising from his seat by the fire. "Then I suggest we both retire for the night. Dawn comes early, and there is much work to be done tomorrow." He moved toward his own alcove, then paused and looked back at her. "If you need anything during the night, do not hesitate to wake me. This is your home now, Astrid. And while our arrangement may not be what either of us would have chosen in an ideal world, I intend to treat you with the respect due to the mistress of this household." With that, he disappeared behind the curtain of his sleeping alcove, leaving Astrid alone by the dying fire. She sat for a few more minutes, processing the events of this impossibly long day, before finally gathering the courage to retreat to her own sleeping space. She pulled the heavy curtain closed behind her, creating a small pocket of privacy in the larger hall, and began to prepare for sleep. Her hands trembled slightly as she removed her dress and the bronze brooches that had belonged to her mother, folding the garment carefully and placing the precious jewelry on top of the storage chest where she could see it in the lamplight. She slipped into a simple linen shift that served as a nightgown and climbed onto the sleeping bench, pulling the furs and wool blankets up around her shoulders. The bedding was indeed clean and warm, as Ragnar had promised, carrying the faint scent of lavender that suggested he had prepared it with some care before leaving to collect her. Lying in the darkness, surrounded by the unfamiliar sounds and smells of her new home, Astrid felt tears finally begin to fall. They came silently, sliding down her cheeks to dampen the fur beneath her head, carrying with them all the fear and grief and anger she had been holding back throughout this terrible day. She wept for the loss of her old life, for the betrayal of her father, for the uncertainty of her future, and for the simple unfairness of being born female in a world where women had so little control over their own destinies. But even as she cried, exhaustion was pulling her down into sleep, her body demanding rest after the emotional and physical toll of the journey. Her last conscious thought was of her mother, of Sigrid's gentle face and wise eyes, and she whispered into the darkness a prayer that her mother's spirit would watch over her and give her strength for whatever tomorrow would bring. When Astrid woke, gray dawn light was filtering through gaps in the wall timbers, and she could hear movement in the main hall. For a moment she was disoriented, unable to remember where she was, but then memory crashed back, and with it the full weight of her new reality. She was in Ragnar Ironside's homestead, his wife in all but the most intimate sense, and this was the first morning of her new life. She dressed quickly in the cool morning air, braiding her golden hair and securing it with a strip of leather, fastening her mother's brooches to her shoulders with fingers that were steadier than they had been the night before. When she pulled back the curtain and stepped into the main hall, she found Ragnar already up and moving about with quiet efficiency. He had built up the fire and was preparing a simple breakfast of porridge and dried fruit. "Good morning," he said when he noticed her, his voice neutral and formal. "I hope you slept well." "Well enough," Astrid replied, which was not entirely true but seemed like the polite response. "Thank you for asking." They ate breakfast together in relative silence, and Astrid found herself studying Ragnar in the growing light, trying to reconcile the fearsome warrior reputation with the man who sat across from her, carefully measuring out portions of porridge and offering her the choicest pieces of dried apple. He was undeniably intimidating in his size and bearing, his scarred face and powerful frame speaking to a violent past, but his actions toward her had been nothing but considerate and respectful. After breakfast, Ragnar led her outside to show her the full extent of the homestead. The morning was crisp and clear, the air sharp with the promise of coming winter, and frost glittered on the grass in patches where the sun had not yet reached. He walked her through the fields, pointing out where different crops had been planted and harvested, explaining the rotation system he used to keep the soil fertile. He showed her the vegetable garden, where late-season cabbages and turnips still grew, and the small orchard of apple and pear trees he had planted during his first year on the land. The livestock shelter housed a modest but healthy collection of animals: 6 goats for milk and cheese, a dozen sheep for wool and meat, and perhaps 20 chickens that provided eggs and occasional meat for the table. All the animals appeared well cared for, their living quarters clean and adequately provisioned. Ragnar explained the feeding schedule and care requirements for each type of animal, and Astrid listened carefully, understanding that these tasks would likely become her responsibility. "The stream runs along the eastern boundary of the property," Ragnar said, leading her through a stand of birch trees to where clear water burbled over smooth stones. "It provides water for the household and livestock, and in spring and summer, it has good fishing. There is also a small pond about half a mile to the north where we can harvest ice in winter to preserve food." As they walked, Ragnar spoke more freely than he had the previous day, explaining his plans for the homestead, the improvements he hoped to make, the challenges he faced working alone. Astrid found herself drawn into the conversation, asking questions about crop yields and animal husbandry, offering suggestions based on knowledge her mother had taught her about efficient household management. For brief moments, she almost forgot the circumstances that had brought her here, caught up instead in the practical discussion of building a successful farm. They returned to the hall near midday, and Ragnar showed her where various supplies were stored, how to manage the hearth fire for both warmth and cooking, where to find tools for different tasks. He was patient in his explanations, never condescending or impatient when she asked for clarification, and Astrid began to understand that whatever his other qualities might be, Ragnar took his responsibilities as the head of this household seriously and wanted her to succeed in her role. "There is one more thing I should show you," Ragnar said as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen. He led her to a small structure she had not noticed before, partially hidden by the livestock shelter. It was a bathhouse, built in the style used by wealthy families, with a fire pit for heating stones and a wooden tub large enough for a person to immerse themselves fully. "I know the journey yesterday left you feeling soiled and tired," Ragnar said, his tone careful and respectful. "If you wish to bathe, I can heat water for you. It would give you privacy and comfort, and tomorrow you can begin your duties here with a fresh start." The offer was so unexpectedly kind that Astrid felt tears prick at her eyes again. A hot bath was a luxury she had not experienced in months, not since before her mother's death, when such things had been regular occurrences in their household. "I would like that very much," she said softly. "Thank you, Ragnar." He nodded and set about the task of heating water, carrying bucket after bucket from the stream and suspending a large cauldron over a fire he built in the bathhouse. While the water heated, he brought her clean drying cloths and a small jar of soft soap scented with herbs. "Take as long as you need," he told her. "I will be working in the fields and will not disturb you. When you are finished, simply bank the fire and return to the hall." Left alone in the bathhouse with steam rising from the heated water, Astrid undressed and lowered herself into the wooden tub with a sigh of pure relief. The hot water enveloped her like an embrace, soothing muscles that had been tense for days, warming skin that had been chilled by fear and uncertainty. She washed her hair with the scented soap, working her fingers through the long golden strands until they were clean and smooth, then scrubbed her body until her skin glowed pink from the heat and friction. As she soaked in the cooling water, Astrid found her thoughts turning to Ragnar with a growing sense of confusion. Every expectation she had held about this arrangement, about the kind of man who would trade for a wife, was being systematically dismantled by his actual behavior. He was not cruel or harsh. He did not treat her as property or a slave. Instead, he showed her respect, consideration, even kindness in small but meaningful ways. It was disorienting, this discovery that her husband might actually be a decent man, because it made it harder to maintain the protective wall of anger and resentment she had built around her heart. When she finally emerged from the bathhouse, clean and refreshed, dressed in one of her other dresses with her damp hair hanging loose down her back to dry, she found Ragnar sitting outside the main hall, working on repairing a leather harness by the fading daylight. He looked up when she approached, and something flickered in his pale eyes as he took in her appearance, though it was gone too quickly for her to identify. "You look better," he observed, setting aside his work. "More rested." "I feel better," Astrid admitted, settling onto the bench beside him, maintaining a respectful distance but no longer feeling the need to flee his presence. "The bath was wonderful. I had forgotten how restorative hot water could be." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of red and gold. The peace of the homestead, the quiet beauty of the wilderness surrounding them, worked on Astrid's spirit like a balm, soothing some of the raw wounds that recent events had inflicted. "May I ask you something?" Astrid ventured finally, her curiosity overcoming her reticence. "Of course," Ragnar replied. "Why did you choose me specifically?" she asked, the question that had haunted her since learning of the arrangement. Surely there were other women in the village, daughters of better families with more substantial dowries, who would have made more advantageous matches. Why seek out the desperate father and his daughter? Ragnar was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a quality of careful honesty. "Because I did not want a marriage based on political alliance or economic advantage," he said. "I wanted a wife who would value what I have built here, who would appreciate the security and comfort I can provide, rather than taking it for granted. A woman from a wealthy family, raised in luxury, would likely find this life too harsh, too isolated. She would resent the hard work and loneliness, would pine for the social life of the village." He turned to look at Astrid directly, his pale eyes serious and intent. "But you, Astrid, you have known hardship. You understand the value of adequate food and shelter, of stability and security. You will not take for granted the things I offer because you know what it is to lack them. And your mother's reputation suggested that you had been raised with skills and knowledge that would make you an excellent household manager, capable of helping this homestead thrive rather than simply existing within it." The honesty in Ragnar's explanation settled over Astrid like a weight, both flattering and sobering in equal measure. He had not chosen her randomly, or simply because she was available, but had actually considered what kind of woman would suit his life and his needs. It was a calculated decision, yes, but one based on logic and observation rather than mere opportunism. She found she could respect that, even if she still resented the circumstances that had made her available for such consideration. "I see," Astrid said quietly, processing this information. "So in your view, my misfortune became my qualification." "In a manner of speaking," Ragnar agreed, not flinching from the bitter truth of it. "Though I would argue that your true qualifications are your intelligence, your skills, and your strength of character, which would have value regardless of your circumstances. The hardship you have endured has simply revealed those qualities more clearly than comfort might have." They fell silent again, but it was a different quality of silence now, less awkward and more contemplative. As darkness settled over the homestead, they moved inside to prepare the evening meal together, and Astrid found herself falling into an easy rhythm with Ragnar as they worked. He prepared meat and vegetables while she mixed dough for fresh bread, their movements coordinated without need for extensive discussion, as if they had been working together for years rather than mere hours. Over the following days, a pattern emerged in their lives together. Ragnar would wake before dawn and tend to the most physically demanding tasks: chopping wood, repairing structures, working the fields. Astrid would rise shortly after and begin her own work, preparing meals, tending the livestock, managing the household stores, doing the endless tasks of spinning, weaving, and mending that kept a household clothed and functional. They would come together for meals, sharing the food and conversation with increasing ease as they grew more comfortable with each other's presence. Astrid discovered that Ragnar was more educated than most men of his station, able to read and write runes with facility, and possessed of a sharp mind that enjoyed discussing philosophy, history, and the natural world. He had traveled extensively during his raiding years and could describe distant lands and foreign peoples with vivid detail. In the evenings, as they sat by the hearth working on various tasks, he would tell her stories of his travels, painting pictures with words of the green hills of Ireland, the stone cities of England, the strange customs of the Frankish kingdoms. For her part, Astrid found herself sharing memories of her mother, stories of Sigrid's wisdom and kindness that she had kept locked away since her death. Ragnar listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions, and Astrid realized that he was constructing a picture of who she was through these stories, learning about her values and beliefs through understanding the woman who had shaped her. As the days turned into weeks, the autumn deepened toward winter. The trees surrounding the homestead blazed with color before dropping their leaves to carpet the ground in gold and crimson. The air grew colder, frost appearing earlier each morning and lingering longer into the day. Ragnar worked tirelessly to prepare the homestead for the harsh months ahead, and Astrid matched his diligence with her own efforts, preserving the final harvest, preparing the livestock shelter for winter housing, ensuring that every gap in the hall's walls was properly chinked against the wind. Working alongside Ragnar day after day, Astrid began to see him not as the intimidating stranger who had purchased her, but as a complex man shaped by experiences both terrible and transformative. She noticed the way he moved through pain without complaint, the stiffness in his left side that worsened in cold weather, but never slowed his work. She saw his gentleness with the animals, the way he would speak softly to a nervous goat or carefully handle a newborn lamb. She observed his meticulous attention to detail, the pride he took in work done well, the satisfaction he derived from building and creating rather than destroying. And Ragnar, for his part, seemed to be making similar discoveries about her. She caught him watching her sometimes with an expression that might have been appreciation or respect as she efficiently managed some household task or offered an innovative solution to a problem. He began seeking her opinion on matters related to the homestead, treating her input as valuable rather than merely polite. When she demonstrated her literacy by helping him calculate grain stores and plan for winter rationing, she saw genuine pleasure in his eyes at finding a partner who could share the mental burden of management. One evening, nearly a month after her arrival, they sat by the hearth as had become their custom, Ragnar working on carving a new tool handle while Astrid spun wool into thread. The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and the wind howled outside, rattling the shutters in a preview of the winter storms to come. "Astrid," Ragnar said suddenly, setting down his carving and turning to face her fully. "I want to speak with you about the expectations we discussed when you first arrived." Astrid's hands stilled on the spindle, her heart beginning to race despite her efforts to remain calm. She had known this conversation would come eventually, that the reprieve he had granted her was always temporary, but the past weeks of relative peace had lulled her into a false sense that perhaps it might be delayed indefinitely. "I am listening," she said, pleased that her voice emerged steady despite her nervousness. Ragnar's pale eyes were serious, but not unkind as he regarded her. "You have settled into life here better than I dared hope," he began. "You work hard, manage the household with skill and efficiency, and have proven yourself to be intelligent and capable in all respects. I am pleased with how our arrangement has developed, and I hope that you have found it not entirely unbearable." "It has been better than I feared," Astrid admitted honestly. "You have been fair and respectful, and the work here is satisfying in ways I did not expect. I have found a certain peace in this life, despite how I came to it." Ragnar nodded, seeming satisfied with this response. "Then I think it is time we move forward with making this marriage complete in all respects," he said bluntly. "Winter approaches rapidly, and if we are to have a child by next harvest, we must begin soon. I will not force you, Astrid, but I am asking you to willingly accept your role as my wife in truth, not merely in name." The moment Astrid had been dreading, and yet somehow also anticipating, had arrived. She set down her spindle with trembling hands and took a deep breath, trying to calm the conflicting emotions that surged through her. Fear was still present, yes, but it was tempered now by familiarity with this man, by the trust that had slowly built between them over weeks of shared labor and conversation. "I understand," she said quietly, "and I accept that this is inevitable, that it is part of the bargain that was made. I cannot say I approach this without fear, Ragnar, because I would be lying if I did, but I trust that you will be as considerate in this as you have been in all other aspects of our life together." Something softened in Ragnar's expression, a gentleness that transformed his stern features into something approaching tenderness. "I will be as gentle as I am able," he promised. "I have no desire to cause you pain or fear, Astrid. What happens between a husband and wife should bring pleasure to both, or at the very least, should not be a source of trauma." He stood and extended his hand to her, an invitation rather than a command, and after a moment's hesitation, Astrid placed her hand in his and allowed him to help her to her feet. He led her to his sleeping alcove, which was larger than hers and better appointed. The sleeping bench covered with the finest furs and softest wool blankets. A lamp burned low, casting a warm glow over the intimate space. Ragnar's hands were surprisingly gentle as he helped her remove her dress, his touches careful and unhurried, giving her time to adjust to each new intimacy. He removed his own clothing with less ceremony, and Astrid found herself trying not to stare at his body, which was indeed marked with the scars of his warrior past. The spear wound he had mentioned was a puckered scar on his left side, pale against his tanned skin, but there were others as well, blade marks on his arms and shoulders, what looked like an old burn on his right thigh, a collection of smaller scars that spoke to a life lived dangerously. But beneath the scars was a body that remained powerful and capable, broad shoulders tapering to a narrow waist, arms corded with muscle from years of hard work, legs strong from walking this rugged land. He was, Astrid had to admit, a beautiful man in his own way, his strength and survival creating an appeal that transcended mere physical appearance. What followed was awkward and occasionally uncomfortable, as first times often are, but true to his word, Ragnar was patient and gentle, taking time to ensure her comfort, responding to her reactions with consideration. He talked her through what would happen, explained sensations before they occurred, asked for her consent at each stage of increasing intimacy. When the final barrier was crossed and she gasped with the sharp pain of it, he held still, murmuring reassurances until her body adjusted and the pain faded to a dull ache. Afterward, as they lay together in the darkness, Ragnar's arm around her shoulders and her head resting against his chest, Astrid found herself surprised by the absence of the shame or disgust she had half expected to feel. Instead, there was a strange sense of completion, as if some final piece of her new identity had clicked into place. She was truly Ragnar's wife now in all senses, bound to him by law and custom, and now by physical intimacy as well. "Are you well?" Ragnar asked softly, his deep voice rumbling in his chest beneath her ear. "I am well," Astrid confirmed, and realized it was true. "Thank you for your patience and care. You are my wife," Ragnar said simply. "Your well-being is my responsibility and my concern. I would no more harm you carelessly than I would damage any other valuable part of my life." It was perhaps not the most romantic sentiment, but Astrid found it oddly comforting nonetheless. In Ragnar's practical warrior's mind, she had value and importance, which meant he would protect and care for her, as he did all his other important possessions and responsibilities. It was not love, but it was a form of security, and after the chaos and uncertainty of recent months, security had its own powerful appeal. The winter that followed was harsh, as winters in the northern lands always were. Snow fell heavily, blanketing the homestead in white that sometimes reached halfway up the hall's walls. The wind howled like wolves around the buildings, seeking any gap to drive its icy fingers through. The livestock huddled in their shelter, dependent on the hay and grain Ragnar and Astrid brought them daily. The stream froze solid, and they had to break through the ice each day to access water. But inside the hall, warmth and comfort reigned. The hearth fire burned constantly, fed by the abundant wood Ragnar had stockpiled during autumn. The food stores proved more than adequate, providing variety and sustenance through the long, dark months. Astrid and Ragnar fell into an even deeper rhythm of partnership, their days filled with the endless small tasks required to maintain life through winter, their nights spent in increasing comfort and familiarity in each other's arms. As the winter progressed, Astrid's body began to show the first signs of pregnancy. Her monthly bleeding ceased, her breasts grew tender and swollen, and a persistent nausea plagued her mornings. When she shared this news with Ragnar, his normally stern face lit up with genuine joy and pride. He became even more solicitous of her comfort, insisting she rest more and take on fewer physically demanding tasks. His large hands gentle when they rested on her still flat belly, as if already connecting with the child growing within. During the long winter evenings, they talked more deeply than ever before, sharing dreams and fears, discussing the future they were building together. Ragnar spoke of his hopes for their child, whether boy or girl, of the values he wanted to instill and the legacy he hoped to leave. Astrid found herself sharing her own visions of the future, surprised to discover that they increasingly involved this place, this man, this life she had once resented but was coming to cherish. "I never thought I could be happy here," Astrid admitted one night as they lay together in the darkness, the wind howling outside but unable to touch them in their warm cocoon. "When my father told me I was being traded to you, I thought my life was ending. But instead I think it might have been beginning." Ragnar tightened his arm around her, pulling her closer against his side. "I purchased you," he said quietly, "because I needed a wife and you were available. But I have come to value you, Astrid, not for what you provide, but for who you are. Your intelligence, your strength, your kindness, even in the face of hardship. You have made this house a home, and I am grateful for it." It was the closest he had come to expressing affection, and Astrid felt her heart swell with emotion. "I have come to care for you as well," she confessed. "You are nothing like I expected, Ragnar Ironside. You are better, kinder, more honorable. I am proud to be your wife." Spring arrived gradually, the snow melting in fits and starts, revealing the brown earth beneath. The stream broke free of its icy prison with a roar, flowing fast and cold with meltwater from the mountains. Green shoots began to appear in the fields, and the livestock grew restless with the urge to roam freely again. Astrid's belly had grown round and prominent, her pregnancy obvious to any observer, and she moved with the careful deliberation of a woman carrying precious cargo. As the land awakened from winter's sleep, so too did the homestead come alive with renewed activity. Ragnar worked the fields, preparing them for spring planting, while Astrid managed the household and tended the growing garden, her hands in the earth connecting her to this land in ways that went beyond mere residence. This was her home now, truly and completely, and she poured her energy into making it flourish. One warm afternoon in late spring, as Astrid sat outside the hall shelling peas with one hand resting on her swollen belly, a rider appeared on the path leading to the homestead. Astrid's heart clenched with sudden anxiety, visitors being rare and often bringing news of trouble, but as the figure drew closer, she recognized the horse. It was the magnificent chestnut stallion Ragnar had traded to her father, and riding it, looking healthier and more sober than she had seen him in years, was Bjorn himself. Ragnar emerged from the livestock shelter where he had been working, his body tensing as he recognized their visitor. He moved to stand beside Astrid, his presence protective without being aggressive, and together they waited as Bjorn dismounted and approached. "Astrid," Bjorn said, his voice rough with emotion as he took in her appearance, the obvious signs of her pregnancy, the glow of health and contentment that surrounded her. "You look well, better than I dared hope." "Father," Astrid acknowledged, her voice carefully neutral. She had not seen or heard from him since the day she left the village, and the wounds his betrayal had inflicted, while healing, had not entirely disappeared. Bjorn turned to Ragnar, his weathered face showing respect and perhaps a hint of fear in the presence of the warrior. "Ragnar Ironside, I have come to thank you for the horse you traded. He has transformed my fortunes, allowing me to plant and harvest successfully for the first time in years. But more than that, I have come to see if my daughter is well, if you have treated her with the honor and respect I failed to show her." Ragnar's expression remained stern, but he nodded acknowledgement. "Your daughter is well," he said. "She has proven herself to be everything I hoped for and more. She manages my household with skill and grace, and as you can see, she carries my child, who will be born before summer's end. She is valued and cared for in this place." Tears filled Bjorn's eyes as he looked at Astrid again, and this time there was genuine remorse in his expression. "Can you forgive me, daughter?" he asked, his voice breaking. "I know I have no right to ask it, that what I did was unforgivable, but I need you to know that every day I have regretted my weakness, my failure as your father. Seeing you now, thriving despite my betrayal, brings me both joy and shame in equal measure. Astrid stood slowly, her hand supporting her belly as she rose, and walked toward her father. She looked at this man who had given her life, who had once been her hero and had become her betrayer, who had sold her to save himself, but had somehow, inadvertently, given her a better life than she might have found any other way. The anger and hurt were still there, but they had been joined by understanding and a hard-won maturity that came from surviving hardship and finding unexpected happiness. "I cannot say I have fully forgiven you, Father," she said honestly. "The wound you inflicted was deep, and it will take more than a few months to heal completely. But I can say that I no longer carry only bitterness toward you. You were weak when I needed you to be strong, but your weakness led me to a man who possesses the strength you lacked. You traded me for a horse, but in doing so, you gave me a home, a husband who values me, and a future I can face with hope rather than dread." She reached out and placed her hand on her father's arm, feeling him tremble beneath her touch. "So perhaps in your own broken way, you did give me a gift, even if it was not the one you intended. For that, I can offer you gratitude, if not yet complete forgiveness." Bjorn grasped her hand, tears streaming down his face unashamedly. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you, Astrid. I will work every day to become worthy of even that small mercy." He stayed for a meal, sharing news from the village and marveling at the homestead Ragnar had built, the prosperity and peace that was evident in every corner. As the sun began to set, he prepared to leave, but before mounting his horse, he turned to Ragnar and extended his hand in the traditional gesture of respect between men. "Thank you for caring for my daughter," Bjorn said. "Thank you for being the man I should have been but was not." Ragnar clasped his hand firmly, his pale eyes serious. "She is my wife," he said simply. "Caring for her is my honor and my duty." He glanced at Astrid, and something warm flickered in his gaze. "And my pleasure," he added softly. As Bjorn rode away, disappearing into the gathering dusk, Astrid stood with Ragnar's arm around her shoulders, his hand resting protectively over their unborn child, and looked out at the land that had become hers. The homestead glowed golden in the sunset light, the fields green with new growth. The livestock settled peacefully for the night, smoke rising from the hearth in a steady column that spoke of warmth and home. "Are you content?" Ragnar asked, his deep voice rumbling against her ear as she leaned into his embrace. Astrid considered the question seriously, thinking back over the journey that had brought her from despair to this moment of unexpected joy. She thought of her mother, whose teachings had prepared her for this life, even though Sigrid could never have predicted the path it would take. She thought of her father, broken but healing, finding redemption through the very transaction that had seemed so damning. And she thought of Ragnar, the warrior who had purchased a wife and found instead a partner who had offered her security and respect, and had received in return loyalty and growing affection. "Yes," she said finally, turning in his arms to face him fully, her hands coming to rest on his chest where she could feel the steady beat of his heart. "I am content, Ragnar. More than content. I am happy here with you in this life we are building together. When I came here, I thought I was losing everything, but instead, I found everything I never knew I needed." Ragnar's stern face softened into a rare smile, transforming his features with warmth and genuine joy. He cupped her face in his large hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks, and bent to press his lips to hers in a kiss that held promise and tenderness, and the beginning of something that might, with time and care, become love. As summer approached and Astrid's time drew near, the homestead thrived under their combined care. The fields produced abundant crops, the livestock multiplied, and the hall became a true home, filled with the small touches that spoke of a woman's presence and care. When Astrid finally gave birth on a warm evening in late summer, bringing into the world a healthy son with his father's dark hair and his mother's blue eyes, Ragnar wept with joy, holding his child with a gentleness that belied his warrior's hands. They named the boy Magnus, meaning great, and as Astrid watched Ragnar cradle their son, speaking to him softly in the ancient language about the legacy he would inherit and the values he would learn, she felt a profound sense of completion. This was her family now, this warrior who had purchased her, and this child they had created together. This was her home, these northern lands that had seemed so foreign, and now felt like the only place she belonged. In the years that followed, more children came, filling the hall with laughter and noise, transforming the solitary warrior's homestead into a thriving family farm. Astrid's skills and knowledge combined with Ragnar's strength and experience to create a prosperity that became legendary in the Northern Territories. They became known as a partnership of equals, a marriage that had begun as a transaction but had transformed into something far more valuable, a true union of hearts and minds, built on mutual respect and growing love. And when Astrid was old, surrounded by children and grandchildren in the hall that had become hers, she would sometimes tell them the story of how she had come there, traded for a horse at 19 years old, frightened and angry, and certain her life was ending. She would speak of Ragnar, the stern warrior who had shown her unexpected kindness, who had valued her mind as much as her body, who had given her time to accept her fate rather than forcing it upon her. And she would tell them that sometimes the greatest blessings came disguised as tragedies, that life had a way of leading you to exactly where you needed to be, even when the path seemed cruel and the destination uncertain. For she had been given as a virgin to a lonely Viking in exchange for a horse, and in doing so, had found a love and a life beyond anything she had ever imagined possible.